What's the difference between a financing and a funding contingency in New York City real estate? We'll demystify this topic in the following video. I'm Nick at Houseit. Visit Houseit.com to learn how to save money if you are buying, selling, or renting in New York City, Long Island, the Hudson Valley, or South Florida. So let's get started. So what's the difference between a financing or a mortgage contingency and a funding contingency? Most buyers in New York City are unfamiliar with the distinction between the two. Now, let's take a step back and start with what is most commonly understood in the real estate market, and that is the concept of a mortgage contingency. In layman's terms, a mortgage contingency essentially gives a buyer the ability to back out of a transaction and recoup their deposit in the event that they're unable to obtain financing from an institutional lender within a certain period of time after signing the contract. While New York City is awash with cash offers, the reality is that most people still do finance. And as a result, your typical buyer, first-time buyer, or whatnot in New York City will almost always have a mortgage contingency. Now, here's where it gets more complicated. Now, the general concept of the mortgage contingency, which we just explained, is pretty straightforward. But at the end of the day, what actually appears in the contract, as far as the language surrounding the contingency, does vary by transaction based on which contract template is used and based on the attorneys who are negotiating the contract. So in other words, there is no sort of guaranteed standard language that would essentially signify a mortgage contingency in a transaction. But most of the time, your typical mortgage contingency in New York City will have a specific loan amount written into the contract. And if the commitment letter comes back for a loan size which is less than the loan amount in the contract, then the buyer technically has the right to back out. Now, one common way this happens, particularly for hot listings in areas like Park Slope, for example, is if the appraisal comes in low. If the appraisal comes in below the contract price, the bank will only be able to lend based on the contract price. So if the bank was going to do an 80% mortgage, the 80% is now on the appraised value as opposed to the contract price. As a result, the commitment letter will have a loan size which is smaller than the commitment amount listed in the contract. As a result, under a typical mortgage contingency, the buyer is allowed to back out. However, in many cases, particularly for hot listings, the mortgage contingency itself is narrowed in scope to some extent. More specifically, the low appraisal is oftentimes removed as an acceptable trigger for the mortgage contingency itself. In other words, if the appraisal comes in low, the buyer will not be allowed to walk away. The buyer will simply have to come to the closing table with additional monies to make up the differential between the actual commitment letter loan size and the loan size listed in the contract. But regardless of how the mortgage contingency is structured and written into the contract, the mortgage contingency only provides a buyer with protection up until the point that a commitment letter, an acceptable commitment letter under the language in the contingency in the contract, is furnished to the buyer by the institutional lender. Once the commitment letter is delivered, technically the mortgage contingency is satisfied and the buyer's protection goes away. In other words, a typical mortgage contingency does not cover the buyer between the period of receiving that commitment letter and the time when the lender actually funds the loan at closing. Now, this period is often called or referred to as gap risk. There is legitimate risk that if the lender, for whatever reason, retracts that commitment or just doesn't fund the loan, the buyer technically would be in default if they didn't come up with the full purchase proceeds at the closing. And this is where the concept of a funding contingency comes into play. Now, with a funding contingency, it protects against this gap risk by essentially protecting the buyer's earnest money deposit during this period between the original mortgage contingency having been satisfied and the date of the closing when the lender actually funds the loan. Now, you might be thinking, well, shouldn't every buyer have a funding contingency in New York City? Well, the answer is theoretically yes. Of course, nobody wants to take on a meaningful amount of gap risk with any transaction when we're talking about large sums, as we are here. But the reality is in New York City that the market is very competitive. And in most cases, the buyer simply does not have the leverage to get the seller to agree to a funding contingency. So your typical transaction in New York City, sure, the buyer can instruct their lawyer to request a funding contingency, but 90% of the time that is stricken down and it never appears in the actual contract. But ultimately it depends on how much leverage the buyer has as to whether or not they even have a shot at getting this. But before we all become very concerned about buying real estate in New York because of the gap risk, we should also try to understand why the gap risk is arguably rather small. Technically, a lender will only reverse its commitment to fund your loan if there is a material adverse change in a buyer's financials. Pretty much the only major risk as far as material adverse changes are concerned is if you basically get laid off between the time you receive a commitment letter and when you close. Typically, someone in the underwriting department will put in a call to your human resources division at some point after the commitment letter is issued, but prior to closing, just to make sure that there hasn't been any material adverse change. Obviously, if you get laid off, then this does become a risk. But I mean, outside of that improbability of you happening to get laid off right between the commitment letter and the closing, there really isn't that much else which poses a realistic risk. But to be absolutely clear, gap risk is very real, and the only way to protect against it is to secure a funding contingency in the contract. But as we've mentioned, very uncommon for a seller to agree to this in New York City because of the fact that sellers typically have a fair bit of leverage, particularly when the market also has a lot of people who are non-contingent and cash and so forth. And if you are looking to buy in New York City, we can help you save money here at Houseit. You can learn how by visiting our website, houseit.com. I'm Nick at Houseit. Let us know if you have any questions, leave a comment below or send an email to team@houseit.com, and we hope to see you on the next video.